Karen complained about my garden. Now the city demolished her house, asterisk asterisk. Sarah thought her prize-winning rose garden was her pride and joy. Her neighbor Karen thought it was a neighborhood eyesore that needed to be destroyed. What started as complaints about overgrown bushes turned into a full-scale HOA war that would end with bulldozers, lawyers, and one woman losing everything she thought she owned. Karen had no idea that the quiet gardener next door held a secret that would turn her perfect suburban life into rubble. Sometimes the person you try to destroy has more power than you ever imagined. Meet Sarah Chen, a retired landscape architect who spent 30 years designing gardens for millionaires before buying her dream home in Willowbrook Estates. After decades of creating beauty for others, she finally had her own canvas, a corner lot with southern exposure, perfect soil, and enough space to grow the award-winning roses she had always dreamed of cultivating. Sarah's garden wasn't just pretty, it was spectacular. Heritage roses that bloomed in cascading waves of pink and red, climbing varieties that transformed her fence into a living wall of flowers, and rare species that garden clubs traveled hours to photograph. Her home became a local landmark, with neighbors stopping daily just to admire the stunning display that changed with each season. The garden had taken Sarah 3 years to establish, and every plant was placed with the precision of someone who understood soil chemistry, drainage patterns, and seasonal growing cycles. She grew David Austin English roses that perfumed the air for blocks, antique varieties that hadn't been seen in most neighborhoods for 50 years, and climbing roses that created natural privacy screens while bursting with color from spring through fall. But Sarah's happiness had one major obstacle living right next door: Karen Whitfield, the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog who believed that every yard should look exactly like her own perfectly manicured, sterile lawn. Karen's idea of landscaping was 3 identical shrubs, a concrete driveway, and grass cut to regulation height every Saturday morning at exactly 8 in the morning. Karen had moved to Willowbrook Estates 5 years earlier with grand plans to become the community's unofficial quality control manager. She measured her neighbor's grass height, counted the number of cars parked in driveways, and kept detailed notes about any property that didn't meet her personal standards of suburban perfection. From the moment Sarah planted her first rosebush, Karen watched with growing irritation. She didn't understand why anyone needed more than basic landscaping, and she certainly didn't appreciate the steady stream of admirers who parked on the street to take photos of Sarah's garden. In Karen's mind, the roses were attracting too much attention, too much foot traffic, and too much life to their quiet suburban street. What Karen didn't know was that Sarah had purchased her property for very specific reasons. And those reasons went far deeper than just wanting a beautiful garden. The quiet woman next door had spent decades studying property law, city planning, and municipal regulations. She chose Willowbrook Estates not just for the perfect growing conditions, but because she understood exactly what she was buying and what rights came with it. Sarah had learned long ago that knowledge was power, especially when dealing with people who tried to use official channels to get their way. Her career had taught her to research everything, document everything, and always know more about the law than the people trying to use it against her. As Sarah's roses grew taller and more magnificent each year, Karen's resentment grew stronger. She began measuring fence heights, researching HOA bylaws, and building a case against her neighbor's excessive landscaping. Karen was determined to force Sarah to trim back her roses, scale down her garden, and conform to the neighborhood's unwritten rules about keeping things simple. Karen spent hours online researching homeowners association regulations, printing out pages of rules and guidelines that she thought might apply to Sarah's garden. She took photos from every angle, measured distances between plants and property lines, and created detailed reports about what she considered violations of community standards. But Karen was about to learn that some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when you don't know who you're fighting against. The master gardener next door had tools, knowledge, and legal power that Karen couldn't even imagine. What started as a dispute over roses was about to become a lesson in property rights, municipal authority, and the dangerous consequences of trying to destroy someone who had been preparing for exactly this kind of fight their entire career. The stage was set for a neighborhood war that would end with one house covered in prize-winning roses and another one reduced to an empty lot. The trouble started on a beautiful May morning when Sarah's climbing roses were in full bloom, creating a spectacular display that had neighbors stopping to take pictures. Karen had endured 3 years of watching people admire Sarah's garden while barely noticing her own pristine lawn, and she had finally reached her breaking point. Karen's first move was subtle but calculated. She filed a formal complaint with the Willowbrook Estates HOA, claiming that Sarah's roses were exceeding approved height limits and creating a visual obstruction that was lowering property values. Karen had spent weeks researching the HOA's landscaping guidelines, looking for any rule she could use as ammunition against her neighbor's beloved garden. The complaint Karen submitted was 15 pages long, complete with photos taken from multiple angles, measurements of individual rose bushes, and citations of specific HOA regulations that she believed Sarah was violating. Karen had even included property value comparisons from similar neighborhoods, arguing that Sarah's excessive landscaping was hurting everyone's investment. The HOA board, led by President Mike Patterson, initially dismissed Karen's complaint as petty neighbor drama, but Karen was persistent, showing up to every monthly meeting with new photos, measurements, and complaints. She argued that Sarah's roses were blocking sight lines, attracting bees that could endanger children with allergies, and creating an unkempt appearance that violated the community's standards for maintaining property values. Karen's presentation to the HOA board was thorough and convincing. To people who didn't understand landscaping, she brought poster-sized photos showing Sarah's roses at their full height, highlighted sections of the HOA guidelines that mentioned appropriate landscaping, and even recruited neighbors to speak about their concerns regarding excessive vegetation. The pressure campaign worked. After 3 months of Karen's relentless complaints, the HOA board decided they needed to take action to stop the constant disruption of their meetings. They issued Sarah her first official warning on a Thursday afternoon, a certified letter demanding that she trim all vegetation to compliance height within 30 days or face escalating fines. When Sarah read the warning, she felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced years ago when developers tried to bulldoze historic gardens to build strip malls. She had spent 3 decades fighting these battles professionally, and she certainly wasn't going to lose one in her own backyard. Sarah's response was swift and thorough. She requested copies of all HOA documents, property surveys, and the original developer agreements that established Willowbrook Estates. She measured every plant in her garden, photographed every rose bush, and documented the exact height and spread of each variety. Most importantly, she began researching the legal history of her specific lot and its relationship to the surrounding properties. What Sarah discovered in those documents would become crucial to her defense. Her property had unique characteristics that Karen and the HOA board had completely overlooked in their rush to force compliance with standard residential guidelines. But Karen wasn't finished with her first attack. When the 30-day deadline passed and Sarah's roses remained untouched, Karen demanded immediate action from the HOA board. She organized several neighbors to complain about safety hazards and declining property values caused by Sarah's excessive landscaping. Karen's second petition was even more aggressive than her first complaint. She gathered signatures from 12 households, claiming that Sarah's garden was creating problems ranging from increased insect activity to blocked sight lines that could cause traffic accidents. Karen presented herself as the voice of reasonable homeowners who just wanted their neighborhood to maintain appropriate property values. The HOA board, tired of Karen's constant pressure, decided to take a harder stance. They issued Sarah a formal violation notice with daily fines of $50, escalating to $100 per day if she didn't comply within 2 weeks. The notice came with an ultimatum: cut the roses to 4 feet in height or face legal action to force compliance. Sarah received the violation notice on a Friday evening, and by Monday morning, she was ready with her response. She hand-delivered a letter to HOA President Mike Patterson that was polite, professional, and absolutely devastating in its legal precision. Sarah's letter pointed out several critical facts that Karen and the HOA board had overlooked. First, Sarah's property was technically classified as a corner commercial lot under the original city planning documents, which exempted it from standard residential landscaping restrictions. Second, the HOA's landscaping guidelines specifically allowed ornamental gardening consistent with professional landscape design standards, and Sarah happened to be a licensed landscape architect whose garden met the highest professional standards. Most importantly, Sarah's letter included a detailed property survey showing that her roses were planted entirely within her property lines and were actually providing a natural privacy barrier that benefited the entire neighborhood. She offered to meet with the board to discuss reasonable compromises, but made it clear that she would not be cutting down award-winning roses to appease one neighbor's personal preferences. The HOA board was stunned by Sarah's response. They had expected a simple compliance or a basic appeal, not a comprehensive legal analysis that exposed fundamental flaws in their enforcement action. Within a week, they quietly withdrew the violation notice and suggested that Karen pursue her complaints through other channels. Karen was furious when she learned that Sarah was fighting back instead of simply complying. In Karen's mind, HOA rules existed for a reason, and everyone needed to follow them regardless of technicalities or professional expertise. She had expected Sarah to fold under pressure, not respond with legal documents and property surveys, but Karen wasn't ready to give up her war against the roses. If the HOA couldn't force Sarah to comply, Karen would find other ways to make her neighbor's life miserable. She was about to escalate the conflict in ways that would ultimately destroy everything she thought she had built in Willowbrook Estates. The battle lines were drawn, and Karen had no idea she was about to attack someone who held all the cards. When the HOA backed down from their initial threat, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. If official channels wouldn't force Sarah to destroy her garden, Karen would find other ways to make her neighbor's life unbearable until she moved away or gave up on her roses. Karen's harassment campaign started small but quickly escalated into daily torment. She began filing noise complaints every time Sarah used garden tools, claiming that the sound of pruning shears at 7 in the morning violated neighborhood quiet hours. She called animal control whenever she spotted bees in Sarah's garden, insisting that the flowers were creating a dangerous insect infestation that threatened children's safety. The noise complaints were particularly vindictive because Karen knew that Sarah maintained her garden early in the morning to avoid the heat of midday sun. Every time Sarah tried to water her roses or trim dead blooms, Karen was on the phone with city enforcement, demanding immediate action against her neighbor's disruptive activities. Karen also began a campaign of social harassment within the neighborhood. She organized informal meetings with other homeowners, sharing her concerns about how Sarah's garden was changing the character of Willowbrook Estates. Karen presented herself as the defender of property values and neighborhood standards, while painting Sarah as a selfish rule breaker who didn't care about the community. But Karen's most vindictive move was reporting Sarah to the city's code enforcement department for running an illegal business from her residential property. Karen had noticed the steady stream of garden club visitors and photography enthusiasts who came to admire Sarah's roses. And she convinced herself that Sarah must be charging admission or selling plants without proper permits. Karen spent hours documenting the visitors to Sarah's garden, taking photos of license plates and counting the number of people who stopped to look at the roses. She created detailed reports claiming that Sarah was operating a commercial garden to her business without proper licenses, permits, or tax payments. The code enforcement visits were humiliating and disruptive. City inspectors showed up unannounced, demanding to search Sarah's property for evidence of commercial activity. They measured her garden beds, counted her roses, and questioned neighbors about whether they had seen money changing hands. Each inspection required Sarah to take time off from her retirement activities to deal with bureaucratic harassment based on Karen's false reports. Sarah handled each inspection with professional grace, providing inspectors with documentation proving that her garden was purely personal and that visitors came voluntarily to admire the flowers. But the constant interruptions and accusations were wearing on her patience and her enjoyment of her retirement sanctuary. Karen also escalated her complaints within the HOA, demanding emergency board meetings to address Sarah's continued defiance of community standards. She recruited several neighbors to sign a new petition calling for immediate legal action against Sarah's non-compliant landscaping. Karen presented herself as the voice of reasonable homeowners who just wanted their neighborhood to maintain appropriate property values. The petition drive revealed Karen's true motivations and tactics. She told different neighbors different stories about why Sarah's garden was problematic. To the Johnsons, she claimed that Sarah's roses were attracting rodents that could spread disease. To the Martinez family, she insisted that the garden's popularity was bringing strangers into the neighborhood who might be casing houses for burglaries. To elderly Mrs. Patterson, Karen suggested that Sarah's climbing roses could fall and damage neighboring properties during storms. She even convinced several neighbors that Sarah's extensive watering was causing drainage problems that could damage foundations and create mosquito breeding grounds. Karen's most destructive move was convincing the city to investigate whether Sarah's property was properly zoned for intensive agricultural use. She argued that Sarah's extensive rose cultivation exceeded normal residential gardening and required commercial agricultural permits. This triggered a formal zoning review that threatened to force Sarah to remove her entire garden or face thousands of dollars in fines and legal fees. The zoning investigation was Karen's masterpiece of bureaucratic warfare. She had researched agricultural zoning regulations and found obscure rules about the number of plants allowed on residential properties. Karen claimed that Sarah's 200 rose bushes constituted commercial farming that violated residential zoning restrictions. Sarah watched Karen's escalating attacks with growing anger, but also with professional interest. Having spent decades dealing with developers, city bureaucrats, and neighborhood politics, she recognized Karen's tactics as classic harassment designed to exhaust her target's resources and patience. Karen was counting on Sarah eventually giving up rather than fighting an expensive, time-consuming legal battle, but Karen had made a critical miscalculation. She assumed that Sarah was just another retiree who would be intimidated by official letters, code enforcement visits, and legal threats. Karen had no idea that her target had spent 30 years mastering exactly these kinds of municipal battles and had the knowledge, resources, and connections to fight back effectively. Sarah's professional background had taught her that bullies like Karen usually had vulnerabilities of their own, violations, shortcuts, or legal problems they hoped no one would discover, while Karen was busy filing complaints and organizing petition drives. Sarah was quietly conducting her own investigation into her neighbor's property, permits, and compliance with city regulations. What Sarah discovered about Karen's property would soon shift the balance of power dramatically. Karen had been so focused on attacking her neighbor's roses that she had forgotten to examine her own potential legal problems. The woman who thought she could weaponize city Bureaucracy against Sarah was about to learn that municipal regulations cut both ways. Karen's campaign of harassment was about to backfire in ways she never could have imagined. The quiet gardener next door wasn't just fighting back, she was preparing to go on the offensive. And when Sarah Chen decided to take someone down, she didn't just win the battle, she ended the war permanently. The master gardener was about to teach Karen the most expensive lesson of her life, while Karen spent her days filing complaints and organizing neighbors against Sarah's garden. Sarah was conducting her own quiet investigation. As a retired landscape architect who had worked extensively with city planning departments, Sarah knew exactly how to research property records, building permits, and code compliance histories. What she discovered about Karen's property would change everything. Sarah's first breakthrough came when she requested the complete building permit history for Karen's address from the city planning department. As someone who had spent decades navigating municipal bureaucracy, Sarah knew which documents to request and which questions to ask that most homeowners would never think of pursuing. The process took Sarah 3 weeks of careful research, but what she found was worth every hour she invested. The records revealed that Karen had made significant modifications to her property over the past 5 years, modifications that required city permits that were never obtained. Karen had converted her garage into a home office, extended her back patio by 12 feet, and installed a decorative retaining wall along her front yard. Each of these projects required building permits, engineering approvals, and final inspections that Karen had simply ignored. The woman who was demanding strict compliance with every neighborhood rule had been breaking city building codes for years. But the most damning discovery was Karen's unpermitted addition of a second bathroom and expanded master bedroom. The construction had been completed 2 years ago using a contractor who had clearly cut corners to avoid the time and expense of proper permit applications. Sarah could see from her own yard that the addition didn't match the architectural standards required by city code, and the electrical work visible from outside suggested violations of safety regulations. Sarah's professional eye immediately spotted additional problems that would horrify any building inspector. Karen's expanded patio was built too close to the property line, violating setback requirements that existed to prevent drainage problems and maintain neighborhood character. Her decorative retaining wall lacked proper drainage and engineering support, creating potential safety hazards during heavy rains. Most critically, the garage conversion had been done without updating the electrical panel or adding the required emergency exits. Sarah could see that Karen had simply walled off the garage door and installed drywall without meeting fire safety codes that required proper ventilation and escape routes for converted living spaces. The more Sarah investigated, the more violations she discovered. Karen's property was a code enforcement nightmare waiting to happen. Unpermitted additions, safety violations, and zoning non-compliance. Issues that could result in massive fines or even orders to demolish and rebuild entire sections of the house. Sarah realized that Karen had been living in a glass house while throwing stones at everyone else's property. The woman who had spent months weaponizing city bureaucracy against her neighbor's roses had been ignoring city regulations on her own property for years. The irony was almost too perfect to believe, but Sarah's most powerful discovery came when she cross-referenced Karen's property modifications with the city's floodplain maps and environmental protection regulations. Karen's unpermitted additions had altered the natural drainage patterns on her lot in ways that violated federal environmental protection standards. The expanded patio and retaining wall were directing storm water runoff onto neighboring properties, creating potential liability for flood damage during heavy rains. Even worse, the improper drainage was channeling runoff directly into a storm drain system that led to a protected wetland area. violating Clean Water Act regulations that carried federal penalties. Sarah documented every violation with the same precision she had once used to protect historic gardens from careless development. She photographed angle and measurement, researched the specific code sections that had been violated, and calculated the potential fines and remediation costs that Karen would face if these violations were discovered. The total scope of Karen's legal problems was staggering. The unpermitted construction alone would require tens of thousands of dollars to bring up to code, assuming it could be retrofitted at all. The environmental violations could result in federal fines that would dwarf any building code penalties. Sarah now held all the cards in this neighborhood war, while Karen continued her campaign of harassment. Convinced she was winning by wearing down her neighbor's patience, Sarah was preparing to deploy legal weapons that would end the conflict permanently. The master gardener had found Karen's vulnerabilities, and she was about to exploit them with the same professional precision she had once used to protect historic gardens from careless developers. Karen thought she was fighting a simple battle about rose bushes and property values. She had no idea she was about to face someone who could destroy her entire life with a few well-placed phone calls to the right city departments. The tables were about to turn in ways Karen couldn't possibly imagine. On a quiet Tuesday morning, while Karen was taking photos of Sarah's roses to use in her next HOA complaint, Sarah picked up her phone and made a single call that would destroy Karen's life. The number she dialed belonged to Marcus Rodriguez, senior code enforcement officer for the city, and Sarah's former colleague from a major municipal planning project they had worked on together 5 years earlier. Marcus, it's Sarah Chen. I need to report some serious building code violations in my neighborhood. The conversation that followed was professional, thorough, and absolutely devastating for Karen. Sarah didn't mention their personal conflict or Karen's harassment campaign. Instead, she focused on the legitimate safety and legal issues she had discovered during her investigation of Karen's property. Sarah provided Marcus with detailed documentation of every unpermitted addition, every code violation, and every safety hazard she had identified. She explained her concerns about improper electrical work, inadequate structural support, and environmental violations that were affecting drainage patterns throughout the neighborhood. I'm particularly concerned about the garage conversion, Sarah explained, her voice calm and professional. The electrical panel hasn't been updated to handle the additional load, and there are no proper emergency exits. If there's ever a fire, someone could be trapped in that space with no way to escape. Marcus took detailed notes as Sarah walked through each violation, from the unpermitted bathroom addition to the retaining wall that was directing storm water into protected wetlands. As a code enforcement officer with 15 years of experience, Marcus knew that violations of this scope typically resulted in orders to demolish and rebuild, along with fines that could reach tens of thousands of dollars. The environmental issues are particularly serious, Sarah continued. The altered drainage patterns are violating Clean Water Act regulations, and the runoff is going directly into storm drains that feed into the Willowbrook Creek Wetland Preserve. This isn't just a local building code issue, it's a federal environmental crime. Marcus promised to schedule a comprehensive inspection within the week. What he didn't tell Sarah, because he didn't need to, was that unpermitted additions of the scope Karen had completed typically resulted in orders to demolish and rebuild, along with fines that could reach tens of thousands of dollars. 3 days later, Karen received a visit that would shatter her perfect suburban world. Marcus Rodriguez arrived at her door at 8 in the morning with a clipboard, a camera, and legal authority to inspect every inch of her property. Karen's initial confidence quickly turned to panic as Marcus began documenting violation after violation. "Ma'am, I need to see the permits for this garage conversion," Marcus said, photographing the converted space that Karen had been using as her home office for 2 years. I didn't know I needed permits for that," Karen stammered. Watching Marcus document the improper electrical work and lack of emergency exits, any conversion of a garage to living space requires building permits, electrical permits, and final inspections, Marcus explained, red tagging the space as unsafe for occupancy. This electrical work doesn't meet code, and there's no proper ventilation or emergency egress. No one can use this space until it's brought up to current standards. The inspection continued for 3 hours, with Marcus documenting every unpermitted addition and code violation that Sarah had identified. The expanded master bedroom and bathroom were found to violate multiple building codes and zoning restrictions. The retaining wall was deemed structurally unsound and in violation of setback requirements, but the most serious discovery was the environmental violation Sarah had identified. Karen's unpermitted patio and improper drainage modifications were directing storm water runoff in ways that violated Federal Clean Water Act regulations. This wasn't just a city code issue, it was a federal environmental crime that could result in criminal charges and massive fines. Mrs. Whitfield, "I'm going to be honest with you," Marcus said, finishing his documentation. "These violations are extensive and serious. You have 30 days to obtain proper permits for all work completed and bring everything up to current building codes, or face demolition orders and escalating fines." Karen's world collapsed as Marcus explained the full scope of her legal problems. The electrical work would need to be completely redone by licensed contractors. The bathroom addition would require new plumbing, updated electrical panels, and structural modifications. The retaining wall would need to be demolished and rebuilt with proper engineering support. The cost estimates for compliance were staggering. The garage conversion alone would require complete reconstruction to meet current standards, potentially costing more than $50,000. The environmental violations carried federal penalties that could reach hundreds of thousands of dollars, plus mandatory remediation costs. Most devastating of all, the environmental violations meant that Karen could face federal prosecution and fines that could reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. The woman who had spent months trying to force her neighbor to trim rose bushes was facing the possibility of losing her house, her savings, and potentially her freedom. Karen frantically called contractors, lawyers, and city officials, desperately trying to find a way to avoid the demolition orders and crushing fines. But the violations were too extensive and the legal requirements to clear. Every expert she consulted gave her the same advice: comply with all orders immediately or face even more severe consequences. Was forced to install expensive drainage systems, rebuild her entire landscaping to proper specifications, and pay for environmental monitoring of neighboring properties. The woman who had spent months complaining about her neighbor's roses was now facing total financial ruin because of her own illegal shortcuts and code violations. Karen had to take out massive loans against her, diminished property value just to pay the compliance costs and avoid criminal prosecution for the environmental violations. The demolition process was brutal and public. Every morning for 6 weeks, Karen had to watch construction crews tear apart the home improvements she had been so proud of. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk to observe the systematic destruction of unpermitted additions, retaining walls, and drainage systems. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in Willowbrook Estates. Karen had spent a year trying to force Sarah to cut down beautiful roses, and now she was watching bulldozers demolish her own house because of her illegal construction projects. The woman who had weaponized city regulations against her neighbor was being destroyed by those same regulations. The neighborhood watched Karen's downfall with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. Residents who had been bullied into signing her petitions against Sarah's garden quietly apologized and offered to help with anything Sarah needed. The HOA board formally dropped all violations against Sarah's roses and issued a public apology for the harassment she had endured. Sarah's response to her victory was characteristically gracious and professional. she didn't gloat or celebrate Karen's misfortune publicly. Instead, she focused on enjoying her garden and sharing its beauty with the community that had supported her through the conflict. But Sarah's revenge had a deeper dimension that became apparent over the following months. The garden that Karen had tried to destroy became more magnificent than ever, and Sarah began hosting official garden tour that brought hundreds of visitors to Willowbrook Estates. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased because of the positive attention Sarah's award-winning roses attracted. The city officially recognized Sarah's garden as a community beautification asset and featured it in tourism materials promoting the area's horticultural attractions. Garden clubs from across the state scheduled regular visits, and Sarah's roses were featured in several landscaping magazines as an example of exceptional residential garden design. Karen, meanwhile, struggled to rebuild her life in a house that was now worth less than her total debt. The demolition and reconstruction had left her with a property that looked like a construction zone, while Sarah's garden bloomed more spectacularly each season. Every morning, Karen was forced to look out her kitchen window at the roses she had tried so hard to destroy. The legal aftermath continued to haunt Karen for months. Her homeowner's insurance refused to cover any of the demolition costs because the work had been done without proper permits. Her property taxes were reassessed based on the reduced square footage, but the financial relief was minimal compared to her crushing debt burden. Several neighbors who had supported Karen's petition drive against Sarah learned uncomfortable lessons about choosing sides in neighborhood conflicts. When the truth about Karen's illegal construction and harassment campaign became public, these neighbors found themselves awkwardly explaining why they had supported someone who was violating the same municipal codes they claimed to care about. The HOA board implemented new policies requiring thorough investigation before taking action on neighbor complaints, specifically to prevent future harassment campaigns like Karen's. The new rules required complainants to demonstrate actual violations rather than simply claiming aesthetic disagreements or personal preferences. Sarah's victory became a neighborhood legend that new residents heard about during welcome meetings. The story of the master gardener who defeated the HOA bully became a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to destroy someone without understanding who you're fighting against. Karen eventually sold her demolished and reconstructed house at a massive loss and moved away from Willowbrook Estates. The woman who had tried to control everyone else's property couldn't afford to maintain her own after the crushing costs of code compliance and environmental fines. Sarah's roses continued to bloom, more beautiful each year, in the garden that had survived everything Karen could throw at it. The quiet woman who had simply wanted to grow flowers had proven that sometimes the best defense is knowing exactly how to fight back. Today, Sarah's garden is more spectacular than ever, and her story has become neighborhood legend. The roses that Karen tried to destroy now attract visitors from across the state, and property values in Willowbrook Estates have increased because of the positive attention Sarah's award-winning garden brings to the community. Karen learned the hardest possible lesson about picking fights with people whose backgrounds you don't understand. Her attempt to weaponize city bureaucracy against her neighbor backfired when she discovered that Sarah knew those systems better than she ever could. The woman who thought she could bully a quiet retiree into cutting down her roses never imagined that her target was a professional who had spent decades mastering municipal regulations and property law. The master gardener's victory wasn't just about roses, it was about standing up to bullies who abuse official processes to harass their neighbors. Sarah proved that knowledge, patience, and professional expertise can defeat even the most persistent harassment campaign. When you know how to fight back effectively, the neighborhood learned valuable lessons about the dangers of supporting harassment campaigns without understanding the full story. Karen's petition signers discovered that their neighbor wasn't just growing beautiful flowers. She was a licensed professional whose garden met the highest standards of landscape design and actually benefited the entire community. Sometimes the quiet person next door has more power than you imagine. Sometimes the person you try to destroy is exactly the wrong person to pick a fight with. And sometimes justice comes in the form of bulldozers tearing down the house of the bully who tried to destroy someone else's dream. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who tried to control your property or abuse? HOA rules to settle personal grudges. Share your story in the comments below. It might inspire our next neighborhood drama video. We love hearing about times when bullies got exactly what they deserved. And if you enjoyed watching Karen get her comeuppance for trying to destroy Sarah's beautiful garden, hit that subscribe button because we have got plenty more stories about HOA tyrants and neighborhood bullies who picked the wrong target and paid the ultimate price for their harassment campaigns. Trust us, you won't want to miss what happens when these petty dictators meet their match.